It's good to see everyone here. I was a little nervous before the service. I heard a young guy talking to his dad just down the hall saying, "Dad, why do we have to have a different pastor today?" I took that, and then I got here at 10:17, and there was about 6 people here. I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting morning, but now there's a big crowd. This is fun. I'll give you just a sentence or two to elaborate on Jeff's introduction. My background is actually accounting. I'm a trained accountant, and then accountants. There's always one or two of us. Then I realized in my university years that probably wasn't going to be where I ended up working, so I started a company in the late 90s that did executive training and team building and lots of fun stuff like that, and ran the company for about 10 years and loved almost every day of it. Had a chance to work across Canada and across the world, and would have assumed that that was going to be my long-term plan. Started getting involved a little bit, kind of prompted by series like this and what I was learning in the Bible to be a bit more involved in compassion and justice and trying to live out my faith practically. So I went for a one-time serve in a homeless ministry. I saw it literally being as a one-time opportunity for me to maybe give back in some way. That night, although I was very uncomfortable, I unexpectedly met a gentleman named Wayne. Wayne had lived almost his entire life on the streets or very close to the streets, had a real crippling heroin addiction, and had a life that on many levels couldn't be more different than mine. And yet probably 15 or 20 minutes into our conversation, when we realized that we had probably a lot more things in common than we had different. And what I never would have expected is that Wayne quickly became an incredible friend to me, a life-changing friend. And that friendship God used to just kind of turn my life upside down. In terms of my faith, it made me look at my faith and my responsibility as a follower of Christ differently. It started to get me questioning my relationship circle and even started to have me question if maybe there was a next chapter for me in my career. And I didn't want that to be the case. But it turned out that it was the case. And I thank God that was what was able to happen, because I ended up selling my company in 2007 and quickly starting up in a pastoral role, getting folks involved in what Jeff called a lifestyle of action, but trying to see all of us in a church community live out our faith practically beyond Sundays. And as Jeff said, that's a homeless shelter. We have a residential facility in our church, so we have a 40-bed homeless shelter that's been open every day for the last 10 years. We've served about 7,000 people in a situation of homelessness. And as the church grew, different various forms of outreach emerged. It seems like every neighborhood has one or two unique needs. So Rose City Kids in Welland became an obvious choice, where we take kids from real marginalized, kind of under-resourced areas and do character, spiritually based program with them on Saturdays. We have 5 buses that go out. And then we have volunteers from the church that on Thursdays do home visits and start to build relationships with mom and dad if he's in the picture. And the most interesting thing has been the last few years with these migrant farm workers, because the church that my wife and I now attend is in a very affluent area. And we would have assumed that there was really no need among us. But as I have found, in every neighborhood, there is always one or two things that sometimes you're not realizing, but they're there. And what we found in our small community, that there was about 500 to 600 migrant farm workers who left their families and their friends anywhere from 3 to 8 months of the year so they could provide for their families. And we've been reaching out to them in everything from church on Sunday nights, a Jamaican church service, to cricket leagues and soccer leagues and a health clinic and just friendly visitation. But it's really, the last 10 years were probably as far from what I thought I'd be doing as I would have ever expected. It's been a real amazing adventure. And it's been something that has had me question things that I would have always believed true since I was raised in a church. We were church goers twice on Sunday, once on Wednesday. I would have had some pretty solid beliefs about my responsibility as a Christian to reach out to people in needs, about kind of God's commandment to all of us. But some of those assumptions have been challenged significantly. And I want to just talk about one of those this morning. You see, what Jeff mentioned is this term missionary. And before I go any further, I want to just say that the idea of who is a missionary and who's called to mission has been turned upside down for me. And that's what I want to unpack a little bit this morning. So first of all, just take a second. I'll even encourage you for a moment. Just close your eyes. With your eyes closed, if you were to think of a missionary, What's the picture that comes to mind for you? If you were to think of a missionary, with your eyes closed, even try to think of 2 or maybe 3 words that would be the best descriptive words of a missionary. We need to have those words kind of clear in your mind. Once you have those words kind of clear and you've got a picture of a missionary, you can open your eyes. I'll share with you, you can open your eyes now, I don't want to lose anyone this early in the morning. Hopefully everyone's back with me. I'll share with you, if you would have asked me that question a number of years ago, I feel like the words that would come to mind for me would have just happened like that. And even the pictures and the individuals who would come to mind. I think the first word that would come to mind for me is travel. Because in my mind, a missionary was someone who got on a plane and went to the least reached parts of the earth and generally brought the good news of the gospel both in a verbal and a very tangible way to folks in need. And I know that the church that I grew up in, we had a missionary map. And it was a map of the world, and our church was on that map, and there was red string to different parts of the world where we had 4 or 5 missionaries. We had their picture, that was where they were serving. And that was kind of reinforcing to me that a missionary is someone who travels. Another word that comes to me would be called, or even uniquely called. Because when I would hear missionaries talk about their life and how they got into this world of mission, it seemed that they had, whether it was from a young age or a moment in a church service like this, for whatever reason, they had this crystal clear calling from God that they had to go. And it would be a calling beyond anything a person like me would feel like they had on their life. Another word that would come to mind for me is funded. Because in my understanding of a missionary is someone that a church like this rallied together and kind of put our funds together so we could send them on our behalf. Sometimes it was a group of churches that funded a missionary to go. And I think the last word that comes to mind for me when I think of a missionary would have been super Christian or superhero. Because I remember even growing up, we would have missionaries that we supported, and every couple of years they would come to our church and just give us updates on what they've been up to and what God was doing in their different parts of the world. And the stories would just blow my mind about just how God was doing miraculous things in their communities, how they've been faced with just unbelievable challenges, and yet God came through with them. And I would see these folks as just these super Christians that were so beyond a faith that would seem as general or basic as mine. But I have to say, I'd even go further. The missionary was the person who lived out probably the best, the Great Commission. Go into the world and preach the gospel. A few people out of a room like this that were called uniquely to go and to express Christ's love to the least of these. And I don't not believe that. That's a double negative. But I think there's truth to those things. What I found, though, is if you ask me those questions today, what picture comes to mind? What words come to mind? The picture that comes to mind for me is very different. And the words that come to mind today would be very different than a few years ago. And I feel like the best way to introduce that to you is just by introducing you to a few stories. Some people whose lives I've been in touch with the last number of years. And the first one I'll explain is a woman from our community. Jeff mentioned, and I elaborated a bit, that our form of outreach in our most recent church launch has been to migrant farm workers. And I would say as the church was getting off the ground, it felt pretty clear. I was feeling pretty clear that God was leading us to reach out in that way. The only challenge was I had no relationship with a single migrant farm worker. I had no relationships with local farmers, so I had no idea where to start. But everyone I talked to in the area said, if you're going to do any kind of outreach to Caribbean workers or to migrant farm workers, you need to speak to Marianne Schlabach. And they explained this woman to me. They said this woman and her husband for 40 years, since the program started in 66, have been reaching out to the Caribbean workers. They've just done these amazing things. They travel to Jamaica every year and visit them in their homes. And I had this picture in my mind of this woman. So they had a friend set up an opportunity to meet her. And I went to her home and I was anticipating that I was going to meet this kind of hippie Christian, social justice, hardcore kind of advocate. And I knocked on the door. The person who answered the door was this person. 80 years old, sweet Mennonite woman. We sat at her dining room table with homemade doilies, listening to German hymns in the background. literally. It was just so not the person I expected to see based on the stories I'd heard. But what was interesting was everything I heard was true. And I'd only heard a part of it. By the end of that morning, she had said, you know what, tomorrow night, let's just go out to some farms. And we did that. So we went to the back of these farms, these great big farms, and there was always a trailer or a shack in the back. And we'd knock on the door, and normally she would barge in and introduce me to her friends. And we'd go to different farms pretty much for a while, every night of the week, just meeting more and more of these hundreds of men that lived in our community that often were very invisible. And it was really amazing because she was able to introduce me to her friends, and then I was able to use that as an on-ramp to get our church involved and getting life groups connected with farms. And now we have about 200 volunteers from the church that are connected to about 250 of these migrant farm workers, and every single one could be traced back to an introduction through who they call Sister Marianne. And as our ministry took off and these friendships developed, I felt that I had to meet these guys in their homes. I had to see what they were leaving and just understand their culture a little bit more. So I went with Marianne to Jamaica. She does that often. Her husband passed, but her husband and her every year went. And she said, oh, come with me. She said, don't plan anything. Just book your flight. Everything will take care of itself. I said, okay, I can do that. So we showed up in Montego Bay. And a gentleman, he actually was a farm worker from just down the road from me. He was off season, so he showed up in his old Toyota, had 428,000 kilometers on it, held together by duct tape in many areas. And he said, get in. And off we went. We traveled the entire country. We stayed in the workers' homes, got to know their families. I'll introduce you to a few. The next picture is a gentleman named Mark. Mark and his daughter, Shantoya. Mark had been coming to Canada for almost 20 years straight. And I go to the next picture. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is Mark's home. And what was fascinating, Marianne said the very first time she came to Jamaica, his home was just that one tiny room where the window is on the main floor. Outdoor plumbing, tiny little cinder block home. But the first time she went there, she said Mark told her that someday, by working in Canada, probably about 20 years, he would add a little bit to the home every year, and then he'd add a second level so that someday he would be able to move his family upstairs and rent out the main floor. And his goal was that could sustain his family, and all three of his girls would end up with post-secondary education. And when I visited Mark, we stayed in his home. He was one season away from living on the upper floor and renting out the main floor. He has 2 girls in college and 1 girl in private middle school. And his wife has 1 credit from Missionary University degree and a deacon in their church. Just an incredible guy. And we stayed there, and the next morning, I was having breakfast with Mark, and I said, Mark, I'm just so taken back by you, just the sacrifice that you've made 20 years. This guy lives away from his family 8 months every year so that he can make this happen because there's no opportunities where he lives. I said, it's pretty amazing. And he chuckled. He said, you know what's interesting, Tim? When I think about it, and I've been thinking about it the last day, if it wasn't for Sister Marianne, never would have happened. He said, I never would have made it past the first year. I said, well, that's an interesting comment, so tell me why that is. And he said, well, here's the thing. I remember, it was almost 20 years ago, but I remember when I came to Canada, he said it was probably the worst week of my life. The work was unlike anything I'd experienced. The weather was unlike anything I'd experienced. He came in March. He said camp life wasn't easy, and the community wasn't incredibly inviting to folks from another country at that point. And he said by the end of the first few days, I was already planning how I could get home. Pack it in. But he said about 3 days in, I was biking home from the fields back to the trailer I was living in, and a woman came to the end of her driveway and flagged me down. He said, so I stopped, and she introduced herself. She said, it was Sister Marianne. And she said, I've been watching you for 2 days in a row, and you don't have a proper hat to be working in Canada. And she gave me a hat. And then she introduced herself and said, listen, if you ever want to stop into our house for tea, my husband and I would love to host you. And he said, the next evening I did that. I stopped in, knocked on the door, and I had tea with Sister Marianne and her husband B. And he said, that summer there wasn't a week where I didn't stop at least once or twice for tea at Sister Marianne's. And he said her friendship and their prayers and their support were the only thing that got me through that first year. And he says, I look at now what God's been able to do through my opportunity to go to Canada, and I know that if it wasn't for Sister Marianne, that would never have happened. And what was interesting, I was taken back by that, just the impact of offering someone a cup of tea could have. But as we left Mark's and went to other parts of the country, Sister Marianne would take out her notes. And I have a picture of her notes. They're hard to see, probably hundreds and hundreds of names, just like Mark, who she'd befriended over the years, and story after story, home after home we'd visit, would have stories unique but very similar in that the friendship between her and her husband and their group of friends had changed this family's lives. And probably about 5 days into my trip, I realized that this 80-year-old sweet Mennonite woman had literally had a huge impact across the entire country of Jamaica. And I was in awe of this, and as we spent time traveling around, the car broke down quite a few times. We had lots of time to talk. As we spent time talking, I had said, I want to learn about your story and how you got into this. And she would tell me her story, and one thing that she said, and I'll never forget it, she said, what was interesting to me, goes, as a young girl, I always believed I'd be called to be a missionary. And then she said, but I never was. And I guess I'll never know why. And when she said that, it didn't sit well with me. And it made me ask the question, here's this person who has had impact across an entire country, changed lives beyond anything I'll probably even come close to. And yet she wouldn't even come close to considering herself a missionary. So I started a bit of a quest to answer the question, well, who qualifies as a missionary and who doesn't? What is it actually to be a missionary? And I'll share with you a little bit of what I found. First of all, I started to look into the Great Commission. And we're not going to get to that for a little while, but it's a great verse, so you can leave it up. No pictures for a long while. The Great Commission is how, I would say that this is who lived out kind of the missionary job description the most. Go into the world and preach the gospel. But I spent some time with our teaching pastor, and we got into the Greek and the original translation. And what I found was go into the world and preach the gospel translates into as you go out into all the world. Meaning, as you go back into work tomorrow. Meaning, as you go into school tomorrow. Meaning, this afternoon, as you go into your community and meet your neighbors, represent me. Bring me to a world that needs me. Whether it is in China, whether it's in India, whether it's in Northern Ontario, or whether it's in Riverside South. I realized that in my mind, the Great Commission was a little bit more exclusive than what I think it actually is. I believe that the Great Commission is for every single one of us. I looked at the definition of a missionary. A missionary is a member of a religious group sent into an area to do evangelism or ministry of service, such as education, literacy, social justice, healthcare, economic development. The idea of a missionary is someone who is sent on a mission, someone who lives their life with mission. And as I spent time thinking about this and going to the Bible and trying to go deeper into things that maybe I took for granted, I realized that Mary Ann was wrong. That in fact she was a missionary, and I found that a missionary, someone sent on a mission. Mary Ann was called to mission. The reality was she was called to Vineland, Ontario, where she lived her entire life. That being a missionary isn't necessarily something that only a few people are called to. I'd be at a place now where I feel that anyone who considers themselves a follower of Christ, if we consider ourselves a Christian, we are called to be missionaries. We're called to live a life of mission. The more I dug into the Bible, I realized that God's solution for everything we see out there that doesn't seem right is us. We're His ambassadors. That missionary, or living a life of mission, is a lot less about where you go and a lot more about what you do with where God has you. And I realized that we're all called to mission. It just happens that most of us will live it out right here. Hometown missionaries. And it's interesting. What I found was the more I started to think about this idea of a hometown missionary, I started to realize that Mary Ann wasn't the unique, that there were stories like Mary Ann's everywhere. Right now, my wife and I are researching a vehicle. We need a new vehicle. And I don't know if you ever noticed, when you start to pay attention or research a vehicle, it feels like they're everywhere. Every stop sign you're at, you're seeing them. Felt the same thing's true with this idea of a hometown missionary. All of a sudden, when I started to look at a missionary, or the term of missionary differently, I realized that those individuals are all over the place. Over the span of about a week, I actually have to narrow it down for today's conversation, but I had conversation after conversation of stories that I had no idea about, that just like Sister Mary Ann, were hometown missionaries. I was talking to a gentleman from our church. I didn't know him very well, so we got together for coffee, and he explained to me that the country that he came from before coming to Canada had a real kind of dire reality for young women if they were in a situation of abuse or neglect. He talked about the fact that if you were a woman that was fleeing a situation or living in dire poverty, the likelihood of you having an education, or the likelihood of you ending up in things like trafficking or an abusive relationship was very, very high. And he said that for years he was thinking about that and almost heavy with that, but a number of years ago he started to feel that God might even be calling him to do something about it. And he said the funny thing was, he knew that he wasn't going back to the country he lived in. He also knew that he didn't have the skills to run a school or to be a healthcare provider. But he said, I started to realize more and more that God had given me one thing, and for whatever reason, he was a really good businessman. He ran a thriving business in Niagara. And he started to ask the question, started to pray the dangerous prayer, God, is there any way I could use this? What if I had a different, or maybe I added a new bottom line to the organization? And what that resulted was him leveraging his business, even ramping things up so that he could fund and start a school and a residential facility for young women in the country he came from that were fleeing abuse. And the school is a Christian school that works with girls from the moment they're fleeing their orphaned, abusive situation, right up until they graduate from post-secondary education. And he started this 6 years ago, and now hundreds of girls that would have, God knows what, ended up in their lives are now thriving and actually giving back in the community. Because this person just decided to look at their life and look at what God gave them a little differently and be hometown missionary. A couple days later, I was helping a neighbor move, and there was another woman who was relatively new to our church, but I knew a little bit that she had a story. I knew she did a lot of running and a lot of races, a lot of fundraising. So I said, tell me about this. And she said, 15 years ago, she was part of what's called the Fresh Air Fund. I don't know if that exists in Ottawa, but in Niagara, the Fresh Air Fund is a program that brings kids from the inner city of New York to Niagara for a couple weeks just to get a different experience. It's usually in a rural area of Niagara. She said, my husband and I opened our doors to a young girl in the Fresh Air Fund. And she said, the moment she came in, I had this feeling that this wasn't just for a couple weeks, that it was more significant. She said, our husband and I prayed about it, and we did some research, and we found that this young girl and her mother had been fleeing a pretty negative situation, had been in and out of homeless shelters. So they started to reach out to mom, and they got to know mom, and the relationship continued, and as the relationship developed and visits became ongoing and prayer became daily, within no time they had committed to mom that they would be there for her kind of as a circle of support in any way they could. And they said, we want to partner with you so that your young girl doesn't have any opportunity denied to her, even education. She said, the interesting thing is we didn't know how we could deliver on that because we weren't wealthy people. And she said, well, what do I do? And she said, I realized that I spend a lot of time running. I love to run. And I do a couple races a year. She thought, what if I just took that and tried to leverage it? Maybe even allow God to bless it. So she started to run some races, but she would just put the word out. This was before Facebook, so it was a little bit harder. But she put the word out, hey, if you want to help me fundraise, it's for this girl's education fund. And a couple 5Ks became a couple 10Ks, some half marathons. Now she does a number of marathons a year. And the money kept coming in. And now that young girl, 15 years later, is in her 4th year of Sunny Cannon University, fully paid, all through her running. And she's 1 year away from being an engineer. Again, because a woman and her husband said, you know what? What if God could use us in ways that we never thought possible? She decided to be a hometown missionary. And what's interesting about these stories, and I had to cut some out because of time, but none of these people are traveling. They would not see themselves as uniquely called. They certainly would chuckle if I called them a superhero or a super Christian. They're not funded. Probably outside of today, no one will ever tell their stories. And if I hadn't asked, it would never have been told. And yet, like Sister Marianne, if you kind of dig beneath the surface, these are people that God's using to change the trajectory of lives. Literally change the world through their normal existence and using what God gave them. There's hometown missionaries all over. And as I've been thinking about this more, I've asked myself the question, why isn't that completely common? Why wouldn't all of us live our lives that way? And I don't have the answer, but I think I have some thoughts. You see, when I talk to these people, they tell me how Their lives aren't easier. They're certainly difficult and more challenging, and they feel like they're coming before God with more kind of requests that they don't have answers for, and it's cost them a lot. But they also say they live their life with purpose. They feel that somehow God's using normal people like them to make a difference, that they're able to be his hands and feet, and they'd never go back. And I talk to other people, even in our church, that sit down with me, and if you looked at their Facebook profile, everything's put together. You know, they're thriving in life, but they sit down over coffee and within 10 minutes they're saying, you know what, things aren't so great. I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I question if there's got to be more than this. So it makes me say again, well, why wouldn't all of us live our lives like Sister Marianne or these other two individuals we talked about? And I think there's at least two reasons that we don't. One is that, like me, I think a lot of us, our paradigm of what it is to be a missionary is incomplete. Although out of a community like this, it's very likely God will call one or two people to get on planes and travel. My belief is he's going to call all of us to be missionaries. Most of us, though, will do it right here. Using and looking at what God's given us and saying, God, I'm open. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I'm open to being your hands and feet in any way I can. I said it already, and I believe it fully. If we consider ourselves a follower of Christ, living a life of mission isn't an option. It's part of the deal. We're God's plan. I think the other reason a lot of us would maybe hold back in embracing that challenge is that we have no idea where to start. We have no idea how we could be living our life that way. We wouldn't even know where to go. And I would say this, it's certainly not easy, but I believe it's surprisingly simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. If you talk to my friends, Marianne or any of the other two individuals, none of them would say that their lives are easier now. They tell you it's much more challenging. It's great, but it's much more challenging. All of them, though, have similarities in that how this started for them was incredibly simple. I mean, 10 years ago, if you would have told me I'd be doing this right now or I'd be running a 40-bed homeless shelter, I would have laughed. I never in a million years would have saw that coming. But how did that start? It started with just being open to having an uncomfortable conversation with a homeless guy named Wayne. And God took it from there. Marianne, I can show you again the lists upon lists of names of hundreds of people that God's using her to transform their lives. But how did that start? It started by opening a door and walking to the end of the street and saying, you know what? You need a hat. God will take it from there. God's pretty clear that he's going to be a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. He never said he'd be a floodlight. He never said, you know what, I'm going to show you exactly where you're going to be 10 years from now. He just said, I'll give you the next step. I'll give you the next step. And I feel that becomes clear even if you look at the myriad of stories in Scripture. If you pray that dangerous prayer of God, how could I be used? God will show up. Micah 6:8 is probably the best example of this. Micah 6:8 would be a bit of a life verse for me, but God's already made it plain how to live. It's very clear what to do, what God's looking for in men and women like us. It's quite simple. Do what's fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love. And don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. The prophet's saying, just care about justice. Care about the things that I care about. Pay attention to who's in need and the hurts around you. Be compassionate in your love. Don't just have tons of, acquaintances, but care at a heart level. Let your heart be wrecked in how you love people. And don't worry about the details. Just be willing to take the next step, and God will take care of it. I'd love to share one more story with you, because if I was honest, this quest of trying to rethink what it is to be a missionary didn't start when I met Sister Marianne. It started about a year before that. I'll show you one more picture. A gentleman, a dashing gentleman. This is Ross Arnold. This is my grandfather. And an experience happened that kind of shook me to the core. It was at my grandfather's funeral a few years ago. I hadn't had the opportunity to spend a ton of time with him, and something that I learned at his funeral was shocking to me. It was in Wallaceburg, Ontario. It's near Sarnia, close to Michigan, right on the border of a very large First Nations reserve, Walpole Island. And when we were there opening the doors to the visitation the day before the funeral, the lineup was as far as you could see. And most of the folks were from the reserve. They were First Nations community. Almost none of them I'd ever met. And as the night progressed, person after person were telling me stories that just kind of blew me away. One person talked about how my grandfather got him and his circle of friends into the local pipe fitters union, which was the first for anyone First Nations at that point, and how he advocated and made that happen. I had a woman explain to me that as she was abandoned by her family, how my grandmother and grandfather took her in, and that to the point that my grandfather walked her down the aisle at her wedding. And a gentleman explained to me that in rough times, my grandfather had advocated to get him a job off the reserve in the plants in Sarnia, except he didn't have reliable transportation. And he said he woke up the next morning and there were 4 new tires on his car. And he said, I knew exactly where they came from. And I was just taking this all in, thinking, how could I have not known about this? And as that progressed and after the funeral, I was spending as much time as I could trying to fill in blanks in my family history. And what I found was that there was a Christian church on the reserve. And that church was going to celebrate their 50th anniversary. And what I found was that they were dedicating the church building to my grandfather. So I was completely blown away by this, and I thought I have to learn more. So I researched, and the pastor of the church is a gentleman named Joseph Gilbert. I got a picture of me and him. I went to the church to visit him and to learn more about my grandfather's story and his role in this church. And we spent quite a bit of time together. And Joey's story was amazing. He had said that in his life, he was born in a little one-room shack just down the road from where we were meeting in the church. The shack was still there, outdoor plumbing. It was just a tiny little place. He said he spent his first few years there as a kid, but at the age of 7, he was taken from there and put into a residential school. And he'd never had any warning, so it just happened. He didn't even get to say goodbye. Spent 7 years in that school, and when he came back 7 years later, he didn't have a family to come back to. And through a pretty amazing turn of events, he ended up coming to live with my grandparents. And he said that as a young, kind of middle teen, my grandfather really gave him 2 things. Taught him about 2 things. One is how to be a welder, and the other was about this guy named Jesus. And he said both transformed his life. One is that he had a trade that allowed him to get on his feet and in time get his kids, and that trade transformed his life. But he said this person of Jesus turned my life upside down. And as a young man, Joey said that he was feeling that God was calling him to start a Christian church on the reserve, which was a pretty controversial thing back then. But he said there were a lot of challenges. One was there was no money. And he didn't feel like he had the age or the support to pull this thing off. But he said your grandfather was just 100% there. Said that at that time, First Nations folks weren't able to get loans from the bank. So my grandfather, who wasn't a wealthy man, lended all the money, which was fully paid back. He said, I remember, he had us look at the steel beams over our head. And he said, I remember when your grandfather arrived with the steel that he donated to put this church up. And he said that it was, again, 50 years ago that happened. He said that even as the church was taking off, about 10 years into that, he started to feel God was calling him to a new thing, and that was politics. And he said that into that, he ended up running for chief, and Joey Gilbert now has been the chief of the reserve for 23 years, as he's remained a Christian pastor, which is a pretty unique thing in Canada. We're telling stories, and he said, I look up at these beams often. He says, I look and I think, man, there's not a lot of people who would know your grandfather anymore. And he said, that's unfortunate, and your grandfather would never know the hundreds and hundreds of lives that have been transformed on this reserve because of the support he gave 50 years ago. He said your grandfather would never know that there has been 38 evangelists sent across Canada to reserves to preach the gospel because of this little church. He said your grandfather wouldn't know about my political aspirations. He said he wouldn't realize that this reserve is one of the most prosperous in Ontario. And one of the key reasons was about 40 years ago, someone came and taught a group of men a trade and advocated for them to get into the union. He says your grandfather would never know that. He says your grandfather wasn't a teacher. He says he wasn't a preacher because he was a great friend, and he lived his life with mission. He said he always looked around him and thought, is there anything that I can do to help out? And he said he has changed this entire reserve. What was amazing was that didn't end It was continuing. See, that day I brought a friend with me. I have one more picture, I think, here. This is my friend Darcy. Darcy is someone who I met because he was a resident in our homeless shelter years ago. He came through our doors. We had a bit of a rough start. There was lots of suspensions and trouble, and Darcy has lived a lot of his life on the streets, battled some significant addictions and anger issues, but somehow God got a hold of Darcy's lives in a way that it blew my mind. And Darcy's life has been completely turned upside down. Darcy went back to school. He was feeling more and more that God was calling him to go to the reserves that he came from and be an addictions counselor. And now he's at Brock University. He's in his second year of Brock University studying counseling and addictions. And just an amazing story. But Darcy said to me a lot in the last year, Tim, it's getting harder and harder for me sometimes to come to church. Because he says, the more I'm learning about my background, the more I'm realizing that the church wasn't always the best player in that story. And he says, I love Jesus, but sometimes it's actually hard to walk through these doors, and I wish that I had someone I could talk to about that. And this day was amazing because as I spent some time talking to Joey Gilbert, I kind of backed off and introduced him to Darcy, and they kind of took it from there. And for the rest of the day, they talked, they prayed. As we were leaving, I listened to Joey say to Darcy, anything I can do to help you live out God's calling in your life, I'm there. I'm in. And just the change that's been in Darcy's life. And I was sitting there watching this thinking, my grandfather never could have believed, never imagined when this step of faith to start this church happened, that 50 years later, there'd be this First Nations kid from Niagara that he was still impacting. It's just incredible. Here's where I would be at. I know that you've been in this Hope Live series, and I know you've talked about this idea of mission from many different perspectives. I've said it a few times, and if nothing else, I believe that the more I study the Bible, the more I see God work in people's lives, we're all called to be missionaries. We're all called to live a life of mission. We're all called to look at what God's blessed us with and kind of lay it behind in front of the cross and say, God, I'm open. And I don't know how for many years I missed that, because it's pretty clear. The more I read the Bible, the more it just becomes so clear to me. A bit of homework would spend some time reading a few times Isaiah 58. I'll read a little bit of it now, but just a great way to summarize it. Isaiah 58 says, this is the kind of fast I'm after. This is what I'm wanting you to do with your life. To break the chains of injustice, to get rid of exploitation in the workplace, free the oppressed, cancel debts. What I'm interested in seeing you do is share your food with the hungry, invite the homeless and poor into your homes, put clothing on the shivering ill-clad, and be available to your own family. And he's saying this to the church. We're God's plan. If we see things that breaks our heart, know that God can use us, in spite of us, to somehow make a difference. And I would guess that this isn't news to a lot of you. You've known that. You've known when you look at what God's blessed you with, that it's not just because you deserve it, that there's a reason for it. When you look at the opportunities and the resources and the relationships that you have, you knew that God would ideally have some plan for that. And my encouragement for you, not only today, but just as you move forward as a church, is just lean into that. I feel like we medicate those callings. We add more busyness to our lives, or we find more ways to entertain ourselves or to do things that are maybe fun in the moment, but we numb that calling of God. What am I really living my life for? I'd want you to lean into that. I would believe, I've had the opportunity, my wife and I came a few days early, and this is just the most beautiful city in Canada. But there's needs everywhere around the city. Some of them are very obvious, and some of them, kind of like our Caribbean workers, you don't see it until you take the time to look. But there's needs everywhere, and God's plan for those needs to be met is you. And I would encourage you to be open to praying the dangerous prayer that I've seen a lot of people pray, and that is, God, I have no idea how you could use someone like me. And I don't feel called maybe to go to Africa or go to another part of the world, but I'm open to being used here. And I've found both in my life and story after story that I've shared with you, when people pray that prayer and then live with that level of expectancy that God's going to use me somehow, God will show up. And God will do amazing things through this community. Things that some of you will be able to celebrate together, and some of you may never know about, because it's just between you and the person or the ministry that you're connected to. My prayer, Jeff and I were talking, I said my prayer in the church that we're part of, and I think it's my prayer for any church, is that we would not throw our old missionary maps away. I still believe that a lot of people will be called to go, but that we be open to changing them. And that missionary maps would be less about a few dots that just a few people from a community like this are called, but we'd actually see a missionary map that has all of us plotted on it, all over the city, all of us seen as a missionary of this church. And that would be my prayer for you. So let's pray together. Father, I thank you for this opportunity to come here and just the openness of this community to have sometimes some uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes it's easier not to talk about this stuff. It can bring in fear and insecurity and what ifs. But God, we know that ultimately your way is good. We know that the more we lean into you, the more you show up. And we also know, God, that there's parts of the world that are very broken. And my prayer, God, is that you would bring the brokenness and the pain and the marginalization to us in a clear way. Let us open our eyes to that, not with a sense of hopelessness, but instead with a sense of optimism, with a sense of challenge and even adventure, God, knowing that we can't do anything without you, but with you, you will use people like us. And I just pray, God, that you would allow folks here to be open to that. And God, even if we were to visit in months to come and years to come, we just be blown away with how you've used everyone in the room to live out your kingdom and to be your hands and feet. We thank you, God, that this is the case in many situations already, and we just thank you in advance for what you're going to continue to do through this church community. In Jesus' name, amen.